Right. So we're very pleased today to host Dr. Sacha Altay, though we just learned that this is his alias, right? It's still Altay, correct? So he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in the University of Oxford. He's working on misinformation and distrust. Before coming to Oxford, he completed his PhD in experimental psychology at the, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, the École Normale Supérieure, right, in Paris, studying why, despite people's cognitive abilities to resist misinformation, some false beliefs are so widespread. So Sacha will be talking with us today about interventions against misinformation and its effectiveness. Sacha, it's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And my talk may appear a bit controversial, but I'm sure we agree on many points, actually. So, efforts to combat misinformation have intensified in recent years. Fact-checking initiatives are blooming, and various kinds of media literacy training have been developed and tested to help people navigate the information ecosystem. Small changes in online environment have also been implemented on social media or are being tested to deter the sharing of misinformation. Games are also being developed to help people identify misinformation and in particular misinformation techniques. And I know you guys are involved in this pre-bunking and this literature pretty heavily. And so I want to be clear that in various experimental settings, fact-checking, nudges, media literacy, they have proven to be effective. I believe the effect size are rather small and often short-lived, like in most psychological effects, and their ecological validity is limited in some cases. But I do not dispute that fact-checking, pre-bunking, nudges, and media literacy training, they can help, like they are effective. Yet, I will argue that they have failed in some ways to properly adapt to the growing body of knowledge on our information ecosystem, which I think greatly limits their effectiveness in the wild outside of experimental settings. And during this talk, I will present 5 general facts about our information ecosystem, and outline their implications for intervention against misinformation. The first one is that misinformation consumption is quite low, and I will explain compared to what. So numerous studies have found that the average internet user consumes very few unreliable news and rarely share any. And by unreliable news, they mean not only fake news, but also deceptive, low quality, or hyper-partisan news. There is quite a big literature on that, and it misses some forms of misinformation, but overall it shows that compared to news, misinformation is quite low. In Western democracies overall, unreliable news represent approximately 5% of people's news diet and 0.15% of people's media diet, like everything they do on media, like social media and stuff like that. But I think to truly understand how small misinformation consumption is, we need to put news consumption in perspective. In France, for instance, the average internet users spend less than 5 minutes a day consuming news online, which represent less than 3% of the time they spend on the internet. And they spend more time doing things like entertainment, online shopping, or even pornography watching than consuming news and being informed about politics or what's going on in the world. The picture is quite similar in the US. The average internet user spend less than 10 minutes a day consuming news online, and 44% in the sample of Allen paper in Science Advances, 44% of their sample was exposed to no online news at all, and almost 3/4 spend less than 30 seconds a day reading news online. So we should keep in mind that news consumption is actually quite small online. And I won't detail this, but political news consumption is even smaller, especially partisan political news consumption. It's like a very small portion of what people do on the internet. And I will come back to this later, but a small minority of very active users account for most of these visits to both misinformation political news and just normal political news. It's I think, a general fact that maybe we sometimes tend to forget is that people are less interesting than we think about politics and about the news in general. And many people, they just don't care. And what does it mean for interventions against misinformation? I think it means that many people will hold false beliefs, not because they are misinformed and have been exposed to false information, but simply because they are uninformed and have decided not to expose themselves to reliable information. So I think that intervention against misinformation are bound to have minimal effects, especially compared to interventions that would increase the acceptance of reliable information. It's something we have tried to show in this paper. We have modeled the effect that interventions reducing the acceptance of misinformation would have compared to intervention increasing the acceptance of reliable information on the global accuracy of people's beliefs. And please interrupt me if I'm going too fast, if you don't understand or whatever. I'd rather have an interactive presentation. And we found that given that misinformation consumption is pretty low compared to reliable information, intervention increasing acceptance of reliable information by just 1 percentage point has more effect than intervention wiping out all misinformation. So it's the idea that because there is so little misinformation compared to news, and because people don't really trust the news, just increasing a bit the acceptance of the news. And of course, not all the news is reliable, but most of it in most democratic countries is. So that's our point. And another implication, I think, for intervention against misinformation is that people will use the critical skills that they acquired via media literacy training or like even pre-banking to scrutinize reliable information. And I think these interventions, they are betting against the odds that given the low prevalence of misinformation, true positives, which is rejecting or not sharing misinformation, will be more likely than false positives, rejecting or not sharing reliable information. And we know that this bet has been lost in some experimental settings, despite the fact that participants were exposed to 50% true news and 50% fake news. And so I think it means that the false positives is a real problem, and it should be systematically investigated. For instance, in their PNAS paper on media literacy, Guess and colleagues, they measured the effects that their intervention would have given participants exposure to reliable and unreliable sources outside of the experimental setting. And I think that's really a direction our literature should go, is what these experimental settings mean in the wild. Like on social media, people are not just exposed to true news and false news, they're also exposed to a lot of entertainment, a lot of things like that. So what does it mean when we generalize from experiments where people are exposed to 50% true news, 50% fake news? It's not clear to me. It doesn't mean that this intervention will not be effective at all, but I think it might mean that they are less effective in the wild than we think. And what does it mean for friction? By friction, I just refer here to the number of clicks that are required to share something on social media, such as what Twitter or Facebook did before the US presidential election, where before sharing, they asked you, oh, but look, the headline don't tell the full story. Are you sure you want to retweet this? And things like that. I think we should consider that friction could backfire if it affects both misinformation and reliable information. Because if people are exposed to more reliable information than misinformation, friction, I think, will mostly reduce the sharing of reliable information. And this is, I believe, what happened here. So these are Facebook interactions generated by the Facebook pages of news outlets in the US. In green are the news outlets that are generally trustworthy as classified by NewsGuard. And in orange and red are untrustworthy news outlets, such as Breitbart and things like that. And what we see that is weird is this. In the second half of 2020, before the US presidential election, there is a large decrease in the sharing of posts from reliable news outlets, whereas the number of comments, likes, loves, and all these other emojis, they are not decreasing like that. In many cases, they are increasing. So I suspect that this is because in July 2020, Facebook introduced friction with a notification screen for articles that are older than 80 days. And I have no way of knowing if this is what happened. And they might have tested something else, but it's just speculation. But I'm pretty confident that this decrease here is not normal. Like, it's not a natural decrease. It's something I think, a tweak to the algorithm of Facebook, but I've contacted them and I've asked them, like, could you please tell me exactly what you did around this time and stuff, and they never answered, but I'm pretty sure that this is not a natural decrease. And I suspect that it might have been something to reduce the sharing of misinformation because before the US presidential election. And we see that it largely affects dark green. So in dark green are websites like the New York Times or the Washington Street Journal. So it's very reliable news outlets. And these are the ones who really suffered, I think, this tweak in the algorithm. So I believe we should test forms of friction that reduce the sharing of unreliable news without affecting too much the sharing of reliable news. But since friction will inevitably reduce the sharing of everything, because that's what friction do, we should find a way to promote the sharing of news from reliable sources on social media, such as the New York Times and the BBC. And I think we should try to do that. And we should not just try, I think we should be a bit skeptical of friction. And in many ways, friction can be good, but we should be aware that it can reduce the sharing of reliable information. My second point is that people are overly skeptical. And I will make 3 arguments in this part, but it will be quick, is that people distrust unreliable news outlets, but fail to trust reliable news outlets enough. The second point is that people are more likely to reject reliable information than to accept misinformation. And the third one is that people underuse social information and rely too much on their own priors. And by priors, I mean their knowledge, their intuitions, and everything that comes from them. So the first point I think is quite consensual, is that people don't trust the news. And in many countries, people are very skeptical of the news. In France, only 24% of the people say they trust the news most of the time. And in this year report from my institute in the US, it's like 26%. So trust in the news is very low. And the latest report from my institute shows that trust in the news has fallen in almost half of the countries they surveyed and risen in just 7, partly reversing the gains that they made during the pandemic, because during the pandemic there has been a slight bump in trust, but this bump is over. And they also find that many people are becoming increasingly disconnected from the news, with failing interest in many countries, a rise in selective news avoidance, and low trust further underlining the critical challenges new media faces today. So I think the lack of trust in the news is really a big challenge today. And there is evidence that people can distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. So this is evidence from 24 countries in Europe, and there is a pretty strong correlation between expert ratings and people's ratings. So people seem to be able to know which news outlet is reliable or not. But I think one point that stood out in this literature is that people don't trust reliable news outlets as much as fact checkers do. So this is from the PNAS from Pennycook and Rand. It's a correlation between trust of Democrats in news sources and fact checkers. And here it's Republicans. And we see that first there is a correlation. We see that both Democrats and Republicans don't trust hyper-partisan and fake news sources. They barely trust them. But an interesting point for me is that fact checkers trust the mainstream media way more than people do. So, for instance, the Democrats will trust the BBC only somewhat, whereas the fact checkers will trust it between a lot and entirely. So I think there is really a point to be made that people don't trust news outlets as much as experts do. And so there is a gap. Another point is that people trust the news they come across on social media even less. And some have argued that people browse through social media, and in particular through the news they stumble on social media, with a generalized skepticism mindset. So this is the trust ratings of news media and social media. And basically people trust the news on social media way less than news media. In every country except Greece. I don't know what's going on in Greece. And these are the trust ratings of people from 6 countries. And basically, overall, what we see is that only 26% of people say they trust social media when it comes to news and information about COVID-19. So most people are very skeptical of the news and the information they come across on social media. It's a bit less the case for search engines, but I think they have some reasons to trust Google more than Facebook, but let's not go into that. And this is an interesting review. I think you guys were the other reviewers, actually, Yeshilada and Lewandowski. And one interesting point in this review one point that I find really interesting is that they write that some of the authors whose work they reviewed expected to find a truth bias. You know, it's the idea that people accept all the incoming information they come across, but it's not what they find. What they write is, if anything, in some cases, a deception bias emerges, where individuals' credibility judgments are biased in the direction of rating both real news and false news as fake. And so it's the idea that instead of accepting everything, it seems that people reject everything. And this article does the same thing with less studies, but it's a bit more sophisticated because they use signal detection theory to look at whether people are conservative or liberal in their responses. And being conservative is rating everything as false, and being liberal is rating everything as true. And what they find basically is that in these two studies, they reanalyze some Pennycook and Rain data. And what they find is that people are biased in judging all news as false, regardless of their veracity. And so I think it's more evidence that, as a rule, people seem to reject the true news more than they seem to accept false news. The last point in this section is that people underuse social information. So this paper is a review of the literature on advice taking and social learning. Advice taking is just you give advice to people and you measure how much they use the advice. And in 45 studies that they reviewed, participants underused social information compared to optimal model of information use. And in only 4 studies, participants overused social information. And more broadly, egocentric discounting is a well-known psychological phenomenon in the literature on advice taking and social learning. And I think it is well encapsulated in the words of these participants. I'd rather not believe something that is true than believe something that is actually false. And I think there might be reputational reasons for that. Is that when you believe something that is false, you may appear as a fool, whereas when you don't believe something that is true from, let's say, the New York Times, you may appear critical and, yeah, a bit cynical, but cynical may not always be bad. Whereas appearing gullible is quite bad, I think. Another point is that people who believe in misinformation, like my cousin I mentioned, are the most skeptical. And it has been argued that these people who believe in conspiracy theories and misinformation and stuff like that, they are epistemic individualists. That is, they encourage everyone to think for themselves, do their own research, and basically trust no one but yourself. Interestingly, these people, when you look at the comments in the fact-checking section, they fact-check the fact-checkers. These people, they really do like the kind of, it's not very critical, of course, because they only try to justify what they already wanted to find, but still, they do a lot of research, they invest a lot of time, and they fact-check the fact-checkers. They reject anything that is related to the establishment, anything that you're an expert, you're from, they reject that. And I think what it means for intervention against misinformation, first, is that there is much more room to improve trust in reliable sources than to reduce trust in unreliable sources. And by reliable sources, I mean mainstream media like the BBC, the New York Times, or France Info, but also websites like Wikipedia that many people, including teachers, are very skeptical of. And I think we could try to improve trust in these reliable sources. And I think instead of teaching people to be more critical than they already are, it might be more fruitful to make them more trusting. For example, instead of explaining the manipulation techniques used by people who spread misinformation, these interventions could also explain the verification techniques that journalists use to fact-check information and produce high-quality information. Another alternative, I think, could be intellectual humility, because promoting intellectual humility by making people aware of their own ignorance and open mind thinking that is increasing their ability to consider viewpoints they disagree with could help. But there is no guarantee that intellectual humility and open-mindedness can effectively be fostered. And what happens after people are made aware of their own ignorance and are willing to consider opposing viewpoints? They might be more willing to defer to those who know best, but it won't help them identify who knows best. And that's why media literacy training could fill this gap by helping people identify reliable sources. For instance, by explaining how Wikipedia works and how some pages on Wikipedia are more reliable than others, and how like the very popular Wikipedia pages are actually very reliable. If you take climate change or evolution on Wikipedia, it will be pretty good. My third point is that misinformation is a symptom of other things. I will make 3 main points, but it will be quick. A small minority of active users account for most visits to unreliable news outlets. And the counter discourses that are fostered by misinformation, I think they mainly attract people with low trust in institutions or high partisan animosity. And misinformation is often used to fulfill social goals, such as denigrating political opponents. So I think you should be already convinced that a small minority of users accounts for most of the misinformation that we see, and that most of the misinformation that is consumed is politically congenial. So for example, what guests and colleagues found is that most of the misinformation prior to the 2016 US election was pro-Trump and was consumed by pro-Trump supporters. So if anything, this type of misinformation, it can reinforce people's belief, it can fuel polarization, or at least affective polarization, but it's unlikely, I think, to influence their voting decisions or things like that. An interesting point in the US is that its conservatives consume most of the misinformation, and this misinformation is politically congenial. So it's conservative who consume conservative misinformation, and they also share conservative. So it's conservative who share conservative misinformation, and it's mostly what we find on Facebook, or at least what guests and colleagues find on Facebook. And in particular, so this is divided just by age and political orientation, we see that it's extremely conservative participants and conservative participants, but older one, when older than 55, who share and consume most of the misinformation on Facebook in the US. And one reason why older people share more misinformation is just that they share more political news. As people get older, they share more political news and are more interested in the news. There may also be some things about digital illiteracy or cognitive decline, but I kind of preferred the explanation in terms just of political interest. But it's a matter of taste. And I think something that is quite clear in the literature is that people often share misinformation to fulfill political goals. But they also share the fact checks on social media to fulfill political goals. So a lot of the sharing of problematic information on social media, I think, often has to do with just political motivations. And I think they are often the consequences of polarization and affective polarization. When you have a democracy that is not well functioning, when you have people who hate each other, of course, people will use social media to share information to support this. And a point that I think is very important is that people are often motivated to engage with misinformation. And in this respect, I quite disagree with Pennycook and Rand account that people are just inattentive and etc. I don't believe that. I don't buy this. I think a lot of evidence shows that people are very active and very engaged with misinformation. They actively look for it. They use it to define themselves, and they probably harbor it. Like, it's really part of their identity. And I don't think people fall in the rabbit hole. I think they jump in and they dig. Like, it's a very active process where people use misinformation to fulfill various goals, but they are very active. They are not being inattentive. And in 2018, Bennett and Livingstone wrote that we should resist easy efforts to make the problem go away by fact-checking initiatives and educating citizens about the peril of fake news. Many citizens actively seek such information to support identities and political activities. And I think we should think of misinformation in these political terms, that we should not forget that often misinformation is political and that people are using it for certain goals. It's not just that people are inattentive and just by nudging them, they will not share misinformation anymore. I think it's more complex than that, unfortunately. And one cause of the problem, I think, beside political and in particular affective polarization, is just low trust. Is people who trust institutions less, they are more likely to believe misinformation. Low trust in the establishment is also associated with conspiratorial thinking, and people with low trust in the news are more likely to share misinformation. And there is also evidence showing that in countries where you have more corruption and less freedom of press, people believe more in conspiracy theories. And in countries where you have better, healthy democracies, like Scandinavian country, you have less conspiracy theories. So I think there is a clear correlation between how good your democratic system is, how much you can trust the elites, and how much you believe in conspiracy theories and share misinformation. The implications for interventions against misinformation are not very optimistic. I think there will be misinformation as long as people do not trust institutions and are affectively polarized. And I think in many ways, many interventions against misinformation, they are doomed to play a whack-a-mole game, where as soon as a misinformation is debunked, as soon as a conspiracy theory is debunked, there will be another one who pops up just because there is a demand for that. There is a fertile ground for misinformation to take hold, so it will take hold. Like you can, yeah. So I think that building trust and cultivating interest in the news, and importantly, reducing partisan animosity could help address some of the root causes. And one approach I like is the interventions trying to reduce partisan animosity. So the interventions to reduce partisan animosity, they propose not only to correct misperception and meta misperception about the outgroup, but also highlight the communalities that partisan identity have. There is just a paper that came out in Science Advances yesterday about that, and showing that when you talk about your best day and how positive experiences, it can reduce partisan gaps, but also like dialogue. So basically, yeah, the goal is just to improve dialogues between partisans. And I think what's interesting is that if successful, these interventions, they may have a variety of positive effects that go beyond reducing belief in misinformation. For instance, they could increase people's willingness to discuss with political opponents, which is an important feature of healthy democracies. So there is still a lot of work to be done on interventions to reduce partisan animosity, and I'm not convinced that it's no silver bullet, like there is no quick fix, but it might be, I think, an interesting avenue. This point will be quite short. It's just that misinformation often comes from the top. And I think it's something we should keep in mind. A small number of powerful individuals give misinformation most of its visibility. These individuals, they are not only fringe like Alex Jones, they are often prominent politicians, journalists, or independent scientists and experts. For instance, in France, Didier Raoult, you may not know him, but he's a renowned scientist, and he repeatedly spread misinformation on mainstream media during the pandemic about the hydroxychloroquine. He was a big advocate of the hydroxychloroquine. He was everywhere on mainstream media, and basically he just confused people. People were completely confused in France about hydroxychloroquine. They were like, oh, but look, there is this scientist that is well-known, that is advocating for that. And so he just confused people. And I think this was very bad. And many populist leaders, of course, such as Trump or Bolsonaro, have given misinformation a lot of visibility. During the pandemic, a report has suggested that 12 individuals accounted for most of the COVID misinformation on social media platforms. I'm a bit skeptical of this number. I think they should not be taken at face value. But I think it was an interesting attempt to show that some people are more responsible than others for the misinformation problems. And what it means for interventions against misinformation is that targeting lay people will have less impact than interventions targeting the actors who give misinformation most of its visibility. For instance, preventing an individual with 1 million followers from sharing misinformation is as effective as preventing 5,000 million social media users with 200 followers. So I think efforts to combat misinformation should not rest primarily on lay people's shoulders. I think systemic solutions are needed, and we should find ways to hold powerful people accountable. And maybe in this respect, fact-checking the elites could help deter the sharing of misinformation. So most studies on fact-checking focus on its direct effect at correcting misperceptions. And they find that fact-checking is broadly effective. It works, basically. It doesn't really change attitudes or behaviors, but it can correct misperception. But it's not clear to me if fact checks can reach the people who are exposed to misinformation and really convince them. So I'm a bit skeptical of the effectiveness of fact checking in the wild, and in particular, the direct effect of fact checking. But I think a promising avenue is just to look at the indirect effect of fact checking as a reputational threat. And I think some evidence suggests that the threat of fact checking discourages politicians from lying, or at least discourage them from repeating lies that have been fact-checked. And so this was one of the first papers on that. It's by Brendan Nehan and Jason Reifler, where they sent letters to state legislators in the US about the threat of fact-checking. And those who received these letters, they were less likely to be negatively fact-checked than those who did not. And this one is a natural experiment where they just looked at whether after a politician gets fact-checked, it increases or decreases the likelihood that the politician will repeat the fact. And so it's just a natural experiment. So there is no experimental data, or there is no experimental design. So it's natural data. But they found that fact-checking effectively reduces the likelihood that politicians repeat lies. So I think the indirect effects of fact-checking are interesting and deserve further investigation. For instance, could we incentivize politicians to be more accurate in political debates by changing the terms of the political debates? And are some ways of highlighting the reputational threats of fact-checking more effective than others? I think this is an interesting avenue for the field. And my last point will be quite short too, is just that misinformation, or at least false information, is not necessarily harmful. And false information can be used in misleading ways when what is said is false, but what is implied is not misleading. So for example, jokes, irony, and satire, it's false information, but it's not misleading. And conversely, you can use true information in misleading ways when what is said is true, but what is implied is misleading. When you say, for instance, some climate scientists think that climate change is not anthropogenic, you're suggesting that there is no consensus, and this is misleading. And in many cases, when people focus on fake news, they focus on that, like, this is what viral fake news looks like. And do we really need to fight these viral fake news? Like, do we really need to fact check this? I'm not quite sure. To me, they look more like jokes than anything else. And this is the same in, I think, 2017. Like, these viral fake news, they are just jokes, basically. So I think we should not focus on fake news. It's not a new argument, but I'm just annoyed by the focus on fake news. And by focusing on blatantly false information that no one believes in and that has zero effect, I think we neglect more problematic kinds of true information that can have detrimental consequences, like partisan coverage filtering. In this paper, they found that watching CNN instead of Fox News had significant impact on viewers' beliefs, attitude, and evaluations, and even on COVID, because Fox News has been underlying the implications of COVID for years now. And what they conclude with is that partisan role in spreading misinformation without making explicitly false claims should be a focus for future research. And I agree. I think we should look more closely at how true information is often used to mislead people and lead to biased view of the world. So what it means for implication against misinformation is just that pragmatic definition of misinformation, giving priority to misleadingness, how misleading something is over veracity, can help interventions have a stronger effect. But I think it requires moving away from the blatantly false statement and fake news that are easy to fact check, but that few believe. And we should focus on more complex and difficult cases where correction could actually make a difference. I think it's also important to keep in mind that people can hold false beliefs and make suboptimal decisions, not because they have been misinformed, but simply because they are uninformed. And that many more people are uninformed because they don't follow the news than misinformed because they consume misinformation. And this fight against false beliefs and misinformation, I think, is most likely to be effective when pursued in concert with the broader fight for reliable information. And one thing I'm interested in is also to strengthen the argumentative arsenal of the people who are not informed. Because many people do not know exactly how the COVID-19 works or stuff, or how the effectiveness of the vaccine has been tested, but they still get vaccinated because they trust scientists and the government. So these people who are uninformed, they do not necessarily hold false beliefs or engage in harmful behaviors. Sometimes they do the right thing, and they are not considered the priority target for interventions because they do the right thing. But I think they represent an unused potential for interpersonal mass persuasion. By that, I mean that when the people who get vaccinated but who don't really know why, these are the people who conspiracy theorists call the sheep. It is just because they're not super interested, but they just trust the government, and so they just go with it and let's get vaccinated. But of course, they don't know as much as people who believe in conspiracy theory, because the people who believe in conspiracy theory, they spend their day looking at this. So of course, they are less informed than them. And so when they encounter misinformation, they cannot argue. They are often disarmed. Like at Thanksgiving dinner, you cannot argue with your uncle. I cannot argue with my cousin. Like it's impossible. I work on that, but it's impossible. So I think interventions aimed at strengthening the argumentative arsenal of the people who are uninformed, just by providing them with reliable information. And it could be a form of pre-bunking where you explain them the kind of misinformation and how to respond to this misinformation. I think it can be that. It could allow them to better resist persuasion attempts, but also to convince their peers. When they will be at Thanksgiving, they can argue, or at least don't appear as sheep against their uncle who believes in conspiracy theories. And I just want to end with a quick slide on the solutions that I mentioned in this talk. I think more efforts should be devoted to promoting reliable information, increasing trust in reliable sources, cultivating interest in the news and politics, and building trusting relationships with practitioners, especially in the medical domain, where I think many people turn to alternative medicine and stuff because they don't have a good relationship with their doctor, who don't have enough time for them, etc. I think we should also try to reduce partisan animosity, increase elites' accountability, notably with fact-checking, why not, and tackling misleading but not necessarily false information. And of course, systemic solutions are needed. Like in a perfect world, I think if we would reduce precarity, inequalities, corruption, and if we could improve interactions with institutions like the police, especially among minorities, and representing minorities better in the media and in the states, I think it could help the misinformation problem go away. And thank you. These are some ideas that I developed in this working paper.
Thank you so much, Sacha. It was really interesting stuff. We can open it up for questions. I see Stefan already raised his hand. Yeah, go ahead, Stefan.
Thank you. Thanks, Sacha. A very interesting talk. I wanted to make two comments. One, when I was looking at your introduction, you presented some of the information, misinformation countering techniques that are currently researched, and then I was trying to compare which of those you actually found place in your arsenal of solutions. And on the one, just at the end, I think you kind of brought back the potential of pre-bunking. So kind of, which in some sense means that the bad news game might actually be very useful dealing with uncles and other people at the dinner table. But maybe your point also was to supplement that with maybe domain knowledge, because it's kind of a combination. So you can maybe point out that somebody is using a false argumentation technique, but it's also, as the debunking research shows, more useful if you also can supply them with something that fills the gap. Why is it that you have this misbelief? It's actually because, I don't know, that was fabricated or something like that. So that's maybe one comment. So that that your call for strengthening the arsenal might partly have been already researched, but maybe needs an addition of helping people to find the right kind of fact bites to counteract that. And then another thing, and I'm not sure, I think you didn't mention that, but I was reminded when you said we need techniques that help people trust reliable sources more and to some extent maybe do what fact checkers do. I was reminded of the research on lateral reading by Sam Weinberg and others, and I'm this is now a shameless self-plug for our website. And on this page, we also have some research on lateral reading where you actually, if you check what other people say about the source, you will realize, well, actually everybody trusts the BBC. I'm not sure that will work, but I was just thinking whether lateral reading could be one way to teach people to trust reliable sources more. And the final comment is quite short, because I fully agree that system level solutions are needed. And I think this is a very general topic, because actually throughout behavioral public policy, people get, I think, more and more disillusioned about the usefulness of nudging and other kinds of interventions. And I'm not sure whether you've seen this recent preprint by Nick Chater and George Lowenstein, who actually argue for being aware that actually to some extent behavioral scientists might risk helping corporate and other interests by focusing attention away from individual level, from system level solutions to individualizing stuff, kind of the responsibilization of problems. And I think Twitter or now Facebook actually had these media tips, and one idea is that it might also be kind of some whitewashing technique to say, oh, listen, we're educating our users. We don't need any regulation. Thank you very much.
That's a lot of questions. Very good. I will try to answer them the best I can.
Sorry. So the first one, I guess, is a question. Those were just comments. So maybe you can focus on that one.
No, but I can try to answer many of them as much as I can. So I think that fact-checking, for instance, is good, but I'm a bit annoyed by the focus on the direct effect of fact-checking, and I would like to see more work on the indirect effects on fact-checking, and I don't know why we focus so much, but of course, it's easier to test the direct effect of fact-checking than the indirect effect of fact-checking. So I'm not against fact-checking. I'm just saying more work is needed to see how useful it can be to hold elites accountable. And pre-bunking, I agree that many forms of pre-bunking are effective and are useful. But I think often the idea behind pre-bunking is to help people identify misinformation. And often I think the premise is that people are not skeptical enough. And I think in many respects, we could try also to do the opposite, is just to, what if actually people were too skeptical? And what if people, instead of being exposed to too much misinformation, they were exposed to too little reliable information? What would the game look like if the goal was to increase engagement with reliable information and to make them more trusting of, like you say, the BBC, for instance? And in this respect, I may try some experiments where we highlight the expert ratings on just the BBC and things like that to see if it can, it's like the gateway belief model by Van der Linden, whether it can work for trust in the news. I'm not so sure about the social norm, whether it would work, because trust in the BBC has actually decreased quite a lot. So there is not much consensus anymore, I think. So I don't know if we can use it. And people who believe in conspiracy theories, I'm afraid they might be less sensitive to the social norm argument, because their whole thing and part of their identity is to be different from the norm. So I don't know if you tell them that 80% of the people in the UK believe the BBC, maybe they might be, these are the ships and I don't want to be like them, so I'm going to distrust the BBC even more. And to be honest, I'm not very convinced by many of the nudges that have been, I like Penny Cook and Rand work, but I'm not convinced if we really implemented it on social media, it would really help. Like, I think it would help like for a few weeks, but then it's like the GDPR, you would have like cookies popping up everywhere and you would just dismiss them and not look at them anymore. So I don't know how I feel about them. And regarding individual responsibility, I think it's a very important point. And I think by framing it in terms of individuals, we may give some politicians free pass. And sometimes platforms may be interested in having some bad press, in the sense that if we say that Facebook has very strong negative effects, it means that Facebook has effects. So they can sell ads, they can sell all these things. But if we say, oh, maybe Facebook has less effect than we think, it's not good for the business model. One of the business model of Facebook is to say they can influence people. So I think that another thing we should keep in mind is we should not like inflate the effects of these big platforms, because that might be part of their business model actually. And we should not put all the responsibility on individuals, because then we forget about politicians and big platforms.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Sacha. Very interesting, and a lot of food for thought. I want to echo what Stefan has already said and express my strong agreement with what you said at the very end. You know, we need systemic solutions. We need to hold politicians accountable, because I think, you know, they are probably the biggest vectors of disinformation in many circumstances, rather than, you know, some fake news outfit in Macedonia that is sort of, you know, pumping things onto Facebook. I think we you know, agree on that. I also agree with your analysis of the audience, you know, that it's a small minority, but it counts for most of the sharing online. I think that's quite, you know, quite obvious and well established. But there are two things I disagree with, and I wanted to get your comments on that. The first thing is your claim that people are too skeptical. Now, if you're saying people don't trust good sources of information enough, then yes, I agree with you. I think, you know, the figure you showed from Penny Cook and Rand, the calibration shows that people are, you know, under trusting reliable information. I totally agree with you on that. But to make the claim they're overly skeptical, I think is dangerous, because the very same plot showed that they actually trust unreliable information too much. And one of the things, when it comes, in particular, when it comes to conspiracy theorists, you know, they call themselves skeptical, but really they're not. They're incredibly gullible, because they will believe anything some random dude on Twitter is tweeting at them, and they will, you know, they will latch onto that and consider that to be a fact. So I think the real problem is gullibility, in the sense, rather than skepticism. It's not that people are too skeptical; they're too skeptical of good sources and way too gullible when it comes to accepting bad sources. And so I think I'm not, you know, I don't agree with you with that headline claim. It's true for high quality information, but it's not true overall. So as a headline claim, I find it problematic. And the final thing is this whole idea of, you know, misinformation uptake is low, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think it very much depends on how you define it. Now, I know all the studies you talk about, you know, that it's only 5% of the news diet, blah, blah, blah. True, but they only looked at a very limited set of URLs of blatantly false content. I mean, these Macedonian guys who are just cranking out clickbait. Sure, if you define fake news that way, you'll find that hardly anybody is consuming it. But that's not what is pernicious. What is pernicious, as you said yourself, is all the misleading stuff coming from politicians. And of that, there is a blizzard of, you know, misleading information, I would argue. So again, the headline claim of saying there isn't much misinformation is sort of, true if you define it in a certain way, but it's walking right past the magnitude of the problem, which I think is immense. And for example, as a final question to you, how do you explain January 6th? How do you explain that Republicans now, the Texas Republican Party a few days ago, their official position is that President Biden wasn't legitimately elected? How do you explain that? That is lunacy, and that is misinformation. That is people deeply believing in things that are entirely wrong and that are politically highly influential. How do you reconcile that with saying only 5% of the people consume fake news? Why is it that if there are Facebook outages in Germany, hate crimes against refugees decline? We have field evidence to suggest that these media platforms do have causal effects on people's behavior. So I think there's a bit of there's a tension there between your claim that misinformation isn't a big deal and the fact that people do amazing things based on misinformation, such as beating each other up or denying an election. And so I was just wondering if you had a comment on that.
I will start with the last point about how is it that some people do crazy stuff like the January 6th or the Pizzagate, the guy who went with the assault rifle at the Pizzagate. And for instance, the Pizzagate, you had like almost half of Republicans who said it was true. Like it was super high. Like many people said they believed it. And when you look at the review of the pizzeria, you had many people who went eating there and who wrote as a review, "Oh, the pizza was cold, it was not super good, and the waitress looked at my kid weird, and I'm not so sure about this pizzeria, like maybe this Pizzagate thing is real, like I'm scared, I will not come back." And these are not the things that you expect from people who really believe that there are some kids that are being enslaved in the behind the pizzeria. And the guy who took his assault rifle and went in the pizzeria is what you would expect. If there is really sex trafficking of kids in this pizzeria, you would take your gun. They all have guns. You take your gun and you say, liberate the children. But only 1%, one individual did that. So I think with my supervisor, Hugo Mercier, or at least he has argued that many of these false beliefs that are associated with misinformation, they are held in a way cognitively that prevents most behavioral consequences. And I think it is the same for January 6th. Like 60% of Republicans, so I don't know how many, said, no, Biden is not the real president, and it was higher than it usually is. But January 6th is a very small number of people, and this small number of people, they are very politically engaged. I think they hate, they are very polarized, and I don't think that misinformation helped. Of course, they used misinformation to coordinate, and I don't think January 6th could have happened without misinformation. Misinformation helped them coordinate and do a lot of stuff, but I don't think it is the real cause. The real cause is that there is polarization. There are people who are very angry at the system and who wanted the system to go down. So this is what I believe. And I believe that many people who say they believe crazy shit, they don't really believe it. Like they believe it in a way that is, I won't explain everything, but it is reflexive. But many of our beliefs about science are reflective too, like the tectonic plates and things like that. They are very reflective. It's things that they don't interfere with our decision-making systems. Like whether you think the Earth is flat or a sphere, it doesn't change the decision you will make on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't change your intuitive physics. It doesn't change much of your brain. It's just that you will go to this crazy conference, you will meet with people, you will socialize, and you will have your nice group of crazy people who hate the establishment, and you will love it. And so this is my short response to the last point. To the first point on the graph of Pennycook and Rand showing that people also trust too much unreliable sources. Yeah, sure, they trust a bit too much the unreliable sources, but their rating is barely. They barely trust these sources. And I think what's interesting, I can show it back. What's interesting is that people, they don't really consume anyways these unreliable sources, and they give low ratings also because they don't know them. They just so of course I think they may trust it too much, but I think the distance is smaller than the distance with reliable news outlets. I need to go back to have my notes up. Then I don't know if it's just a semantic problem, because yeah, in a way, people who believe in conspiracy theories, I agree, they can be qualified as gullible, like they believe the conspiracy theories, and I think it's just a semantic problem, because would you say that people who trust the BBC, they are gullible because they accept information from the BBC? I don't know, like I have problem with this gullibility thing. I don't know. It's because you trust the source, you can accept the information, and when you have good reason to trust the source, like the BBC scientist or whatever, you're not gullible. You know, you're just
yes.
And so you're gullible only when the source is not reliable. But then psychologically, these people, they really trust Didier Raoult. They really trust all these crazy scientists who. So I don't know. I'm just saying they are too skeptical because they reject a lot of information from mainstream media, and most of the information they come across, they reject it. That's why I say they are skeptical. But it's true that it can be framed in other ways, and I need to think about it because I think it's not a trivial point. And I just want to just answer the second question, because I think I disagree on your point about the prevalence of misinformation. You said that they rely on a limited set of URLs, but they don't. What they do is they rely on a large number of news outlets and sources that have been identified. And for example, NewsGuard in the US, they have like 3,000 sources that have been.
Yeah, but if you look at the Grinberg et al. And Guess et al.
Yeah.
But what they call bad information is a very small subset.
Yes. But I'm saying, and myself, I've been doing some work using the NewsGuard definition in France, Germany, the UK, and the US, and with very large definition of misinformation, including many sources of information. And so I think it's a very broad definition, because everything that Breitbart shares is not misinformation. And NewsGuard really has an exhaustive coverage. And what we find is that when it comes to web traffic to these websites is very low. On Facebook, in the UK and Germany, engagement with these sources is also very low. But in France, in the UK, it's not that low. It represents almost 1/4 or one quarter of all engagement with news outlets. So I think in France and the US, these unreliable news outlets and unreliable sources in general are actually quite popular, but it's not the case everywhere. And it's not the case in the UK, it's not the case in Germany. And I think we don't know enough about what's happening around the world. We just know the US. So, and I totally agree about misleading stuff coming from politicians. And we should study that more, but it becomes tricky. Because we need to target politicians, and I don't know, it's tricky, but we should go in this direction, I think.
I am doing a bad job at monitoring this discussion, because we've already put 2 minutes past the hour, and we have another meeting. But I see that Musin has a question, and I wonder if this is a quick one that we can do, or maybe you could catch up later.
It's not really a question. It's just something that I wanted to point out that I was thinking about when you guys were discussing the number of people who necessarily believe in misinformation and its consequences. So one thing I would say is, regardless of how many people believe misinformation on a daily basis, yearly basis, whatever, the reality is, from my point of view, is that you do not need a lot of people believing a particular piece of misinformation for terrible things to happen, right? In most cases, you get, although exceedingly rare in extremism, lone actors happen all the time. And we know from the extremist literature that committing acts of extremism is exceedingly rare in itself, right? so those two things coincide. And then you made the point about January 6th. And of course, misinformation was not the only thing that made those people go out that day and commit those acts of extremism. In the extremist research, what's generally accepted by a lot of people in the area is that there are three main things that need to be considered as to why someone commits an act of extremism: the need, the network, and the narrative. And what the issue here is, when it comes to these kind of acts of extremism, the misinformation is embedded in the narrative. And then obviously you have the need and the network. I think there's truth to what both of you are saying. I think sometimes with these issues, it's so complicated, you don't know where to start, you don't know where to end, because who knows why anyone does anything.
No, I will answer in 30 seconds. Yeah, I agree. And I'm not saying we should stop studying or we should stop fighting misinformation. I'm just saying that maybe we have been too crazy about misinformation. When you see all the headlines about misinformation causing Trump to be elected, the Brexit and everything, and I think we have excessively focused on misinformation. And I'm scared that if we focus too much on misinformation, saying it's a big problem, it's everywhere, etc., it might confuse people. They might be like, okay, there is misinformation everywhere. I need to be very skeptical of everything. And it's kind of a flooding effect where you're just like, there is misinformation everywhere. I cannot know the truth. And I'm just worried about that.
No, I think, yes, so am I, very much. I think you're absolutely right about that, general cynicism is the last thing we want. We want people to discern and to trust.
Yep.
And I totally agree with you on that. Yes.
Amazing.
All right. So thank you so much, Sacha, for this really interesting talk and discussion.
It was very nice. Don't hesitate to shoot me an email or whatever if you have comments I couldn't answer or something. It was very nice talking to you.
Thank you. So I'll be stopping the recording right now.